A lot of these things that just thinking about using maximum growth potential would be stuff that doesn't fall sometimes into the purview of training. So getting adequate sleep.
Someone says, okay, my MAV, maximum adaptive volume, for let's say quads is like 12 sets per week with how much sleep I get. But if you got more sleep, your maximum adaptive volume might not be 12 sets per week. It might be 14.
Exactly.
Or it's still 12 sets per week, but each set grows you more because instead of doing sets and then not sleeping and your body's like, are we fucking around or what are we doing? You actually get some growth going on. Daniel Plotkin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's an honor. Daniel, you were a student at the master's program, Brad Schoenfeld's Strength and Conditioning Master's Program. And now you are a PhD student currently at Auburn under Mike Roberts in Mike Roberts' lab, which for folks not in the know puts out like a third of all the research on getting jacked and lean and taking supplements and stuff.
Especially with human biopsies, yeah.
Yes. You guys do a lot of biopsies, which means taking flesh out of people's bodies to go send it to laboratories.
Yep.
Quite dehumanizing, but for science.
They get paid well, so that's all I'm going to say on that.
Do they really?
Yeah. For biopsy studies, typical studies, just regular training type situation, probably $200, $100. But for biopsy studies, $1,500 for college students. Not
Scott, you ready to get parts of you pulled out for money?
Tell me when.
I'm just envisioning how much muscle I have and how much money I cost.
A lot. Because we get like 15, 20 milligrams per individual.
I got a lot of those, bro.
Yeah, you got a lot of milligrams.
I take more than 15 or 20 milligrams a day, if you know what I mean.
That's probably equally I don't know about the cost. Actually, you'll let me know if that's on.
Sure. Not remotely that expensive. You were one of my students when I was a professor for Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, and I got to say, you're one of the best students I've ever had.
Thank you.
And now you're in the mix producing research and you know a lot of stuff and you've lifted weights for a long time. You were a competitive wrestler for some time, coached wrestling as well. So you have one foot in the academy and one foot on people's throats. That's jiu-jitsu you do now also?
Yeah.
My man. So I have to ask you some questions. Please answer them as truthfully as possible. Technically, that couch is a lie detector.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really? How does it detect? Is it based on
anal probe?
Oh, I felt that initially, and I kind of liked it. So I don't know. Now I'm starting to question my.
No, the couch says you're not lying.
Oh, perfect.
You did like it.
Perfect.
Speaking of liking stuff, there is a new study comparing Nordic curls versus seated hamstring curls. First of all, what the hell is a Nordic curl? Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, so basically you would strap your ankles and then just draw.
Usually when I strap my ankles, we're in a different room entirely for exercise. But okay, you strap your ankles behind you.
Yes.
Oh boy, this description gets worse. You're on your knees. Your hands are on the ground.
You kind of have to see it. Just describing it is kind of weird.
Scott, who edits these? Alex, please get a video demonstrating the exercise. All right, so you're basically doing, it's like a reverse hamstring curl.
Yep.
In a hamstring curl, your body is rigid and only your shank moves. But in a Nordic curl, your shank is held rigid, but the rest of your body moves. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so the leverage of the Nordic curl makes it such that you have a high degree of tension at the longest muscle length of the hamstrings at the bottom and essentially zero tension at the top.
Yep.
And you can do these with your body weight. You can do them push-off style to help with your hands because they're really challenging. And if you're some kind of real huge pimp, you can like hold weight to your chest while you do them. Have you ever seen anyone actually do weighted Nordic curls before?
I've seen with like vests.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
Full ROM.
Yes.
Holy crap.
Full ROM.
Yeah.
Sometimes even coming back up, which is trippy and maybe not a Nordic anymore, but yeah.
Yeah. So the Nordic curl typically is done as an eccentric only.
Yes.
Eccentric only. So you slow your fall and then you push off of something to come back up and then you slow your fall.
Yep.
Seated hamstring curls, like you sit down into a machine, you look at the machine's name, it says seated hamstring curl, and you just do whatever the machine says. What's the nature of the study? What was the setup? Who were the subjects? What did they find?
Yeah, so they were untrained individuals, and I recently learned how to, I asked GPT how to pronounce the author's name, and I think it's Maeo. So you might have heard of many of these studies, Meow and colleagues.
Yeah. The Portuguese and Brazilian researchers they have names that are impossible for us to pronounce. I think
this is actually Japan. So,
JK.
Yeah. So I don't know. There are a lot of like Zhaos and things like that sometimes could actually be, Asian culture.
Yeah, that's true.
Like
that's
you're
true.
like, what's going on? But yeah, I think this was out of Japan.
Okay.
So Maeo. And colleagues, Maeo, but I asked GPT how to pronounce that. I couldn't find it anywhere on the internet. Usually a nice little YouTube video comes up. I couldn't find it. So GPT, and I asked if it was confident, was like, yeah, kanji, the way this works. And it seemed very confident.
That's dope.
So for now, I'm going to go with Maeo, but if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. The comments.
GPT hasn't heard spoken human language ever, but it's not trained on audio data. It's a little bit of a problem.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, okay, meow. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's how I was pronouncing it before, so I have no idea, though.
All right, so what do they do?
So yeah,
untrained subjects, which means just recreationally healthy 18 to 22-year-old males, I assume?
Yeah, I believe they were all males, yep. So they did 2 eccentric overload conditions. One was seated hamstring curls, so they went down with 2 legs and then up with just 1.
Ooh, which means it's easy on the way down, but on the way back up, you're struggling to do it with 1 leg. So it's intentionally overloaded on the eccentric. Okay.
Exactly, yep. And then the other group did just Nordic hamstring curls.
Okay.
So that was the comparison.
Okay.
And what they found was basically similar to other studies they've done themselves, is that the seated hamstring curl produced more growth in pretty much all the hamstring heads, except for one of the heads, which was the short head of the biceps femoris. So it's interesting in that it jives with other research where if you put the muscle in a more lengthened position, so the hamstring crosses both the knee and the hip. So in the seated position, it's more lengthened. So if you work that muscle in a more lengthened position, you'll get more growth, generally speaking, from all the untrained individual data that we have. But the cool part is that the one hamstring that doesn't cross the hip
only crosses the knee,
actually grew more in the Nordic condition, which is exactly what you were getting at, which it's hardest in the lengthened position, even though the hamstring is not in the most lengthened position.
Total.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes. So basically, are we still saying there are 3 heads in the hamstrings? Because I've heard a couple raw takes lately about technically it's more complicated.
Yeah, there's like basically in one of the heads, there's like literally an aponeurosis in the middle, which makes it like it's almost 2 independent heads. Okay. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of semantic there because it works as one unit pretty much. But yeah.
Okay. So semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris.
Yes. Short and long head. Yep.
Yes. Okay. Yep. Oh, it has a short and long head in there.
So yeah, so that's the biceps. So the biceps femoris is the one with the short head and the long head. And the semitendinosus, semimembranosus are just their own muscle.
Yes, entities. And they cross the hip, but the biceps femoris does not.
The biceps femoris short head does not.
Short head, but the long head does.
Yeah, so basically, just for clarity, there's, we will consider for the purposes of the simplicity in this conversation 4 heads: semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris long head, all cross the hip. Biceps femoris short head, which is a pretty small muscle, but still only crosses the knee, so it's a nice little proof of concept in terms of seeing what happens to it. All the ones that crossed the knee and the hip grew more in the seated position, but the one that didn't grew, but the biceps femoris short head grew more in the Nordic condition, which is kind of a cool little...
It's very cool. Yeah. Tell us why you expect the seated leg curl based on the anatomical positioning of the hips and the upper body. Why do you expect that to grow more muscle in most of the hamstrings than the Nordic curl?
Yeah, so in terms of mechanisms, it's interesting that we kind of don't really know, but at least in untrained individuals, the research seems to be very consistent that working a muscle in the lengthened position, as long as the resistance curve is similar, so research on tricep push down versus tricep overhead, research on leaning back in a leg extension for the rectus femoris, which crosses
pre-stretching it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then leaning forward in the hamstrings at the hip in the leg curl, because so in the Nordic curl, your upper leg and your upper body are one rigid segment, roughly.
Yep.
And so you don't have a pre-stretch at the hip because the hip is not positioned into flexion. But during the seated leg curl, you're sitting upright. And thus, when you get to the top of the leg curl, the muscles here are already pre-stretched. So you get a really gnarly stretch through that whole thing at the top. But you have roughly even tension throughout the whole curve. However, in the short head of the biceps femoris, you have the advantage going to the Nordic curl, because in the Nordic curl, the pre-stretch doesn't matter because the biceps femoris doesn't cross the hip. It doesn't get pre-stretched if you sit upright versus lay back. And at the same time, the Nordic curl has the advantage that at the stretch position for the musculature that crosses the knee, that's where you have the highest forces.
Exactly.
And at the top, you have almost no force, but with the lying or the seated leg curl, you do get a baller stretch in 3 out of the 4 heads of the hamstrings, but not that 4th one. So it's kind of like when you have 4 friends and 3 of them are like, "You ready for the party tonight?" And then the 4th friend's like, "What party?" And they're like, "Oh, I meant to say study session. Sorry, Jim. It's just nobody likes you." And then he's like, "Is it because I'm short?" It's like, yeah.
That was pretty good.
Yeah.
That was pretty good.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can imagine that literally the bottom of the Nordic curl looks like you're standing upright. That's not the most stretched position of the hamstring. In order to get the most stretch in the hamstring, you would have to actually bend at the hip.
Yes.
So if you were to tell somebody, all right, stretch the hamstring, they would bend down. Their knee is already straight, and then they bend at the hip. Nordic hamstring curl, that person's lying down. You stand them upright. They're just standing upright. They're not bending over. So that's exactly right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a very interesting result. What do you think about, before we get into implications of the study, what do you think about studies on untrained individuals versus trained individuals? Because I'll give you 2 perspectives and I want you to give me your own somewhere between the 2 or on the outsides of the 2, maybe even more extreme. So one perspective is human physiology is 92% identical to that of a mouse. Human physiology between a 4'4" Chilean woman and a 6'8" Nigerian man is but 4 levels of machine learning depth undifferentiable between humans. Mm-hmm. And so trained versus untrained for basic mechanistic induction is such a pointless distinction. Like, you're like, do a study on elephants. You're like, well, how much do they weigh? Like, shut up. It's an elephant, right? Like, whatever, a lot. Sure. That level of difference basically doesn't matter. We can't say a lot of super practical stuff maybe, but deep physiological mechanisms, anatomical stuff, all good to go on untrained people. That's one position. The other position is, I can't do this one really without doing the bro voice. So here goes the bro voice.
Can't wait.
These fucking untrained people, man. You gotta do studies on real dudes in the fucking gym, bro. Fucking do shit, man. None of this fucking science shit works, man. And then insert a reference to homosexuality. Usually I like to do that towards the end.
Yep. I've heard that many times.
Yes,
for
yes,
sure.
We've all heard.
Usually they talk about how much they bench afterward and something along those lines.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. And I almost never have a profile picture, which is good. Good news.
For sure.
There's validity to both, right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely validity to both. This could be, a very, very long conversation, and I've given it, a considerable amount of thought. I think that the vast, vast, vast majority of questions can actually be answered with untrained individuals with actually sometimes more clarity than in trained individuals.
I know why, but maybe I'm wrong.
Okay.
Tell us why with more clarity. I have a suspicion.
I think there's a few reasons. One is that when you have a very specific question, let's say you have that question that we were just talking about with comparing two exercises, you don't have history effects. So you don't have a whole training history leading up to that study, which could have major implications to what actually occurs.
Easy. Someone has trained the seated leg curl a ton and never trained the Nordic curl. They're in the study. The Nordic curl beats the seated leg curl, everything on straight up novelty effects. Okay.
For sure.
All right.
The second is that you also have to somewhat account for volume. So if you have an untrained individual, their minimum effective volume, or what you can do with them to make them grow, is not an absurd amount. It's a very small amount, actually. So in those individuals, you can isolate two exercises and have them do a moderate amount of sets, and you can make those comparisons perfectly. But you get a trained individual that's coming in that's maybe been doing, 12, 15 or so sets per week for a given muscle group, and you want to compare specific exercises because you want to glean something specific about, length tension, something along those lines. You're like, oh crap, am I going to be doing 15 sets or 10 sets even? Like, just 10 sets alone is just the
hamstring work.
Just hamstring.
That's a lot.
Yeah, exactly. So what they're coming in with is a higher threshold where you need to now account for, all right, am I going to put another exercise in? And that might confound things to some extent.
Yes.
So that's a consideration. And then I think the most major consideration is what lines of research have actually found differences between trained and untrained. And if you look across them, it's actually pretty stark in terms of how many have found directionally very similar outcomes. So you have volume research. People commonly say, oh, like the stimulus from for a trained versus untrained is huge. They can get away with much less volume, meaning the untrained can do way less. But directionally, it seems to be the case that pretty much every study looking at even pretty high volumes in trained and untrained have directionally pointed toward more growth in untrained, and especially in untrained, actually, because they never went super high in the untrained individuals. We have some studies in trained that were pretty neutral at the very high volumes, and you saw that tapering. In untrained, it kind of went up to, I think 20 something sets for the vast majority of the studies other than one, and that one went up to 45, and it still trended toward more growth in untrained. So we got volume, then we got rest periods, then we got frequency. Like, all of these pointed in the same direction, trained versus untrained. The two contexts I can think of, and you could probably surmise these just logically without having to really do the studies, but it's cool that we have them, is minimum effective volume is obviously lower. So like you can have a trained individual. The fact that we see 3 sets or so is enough for maintenance volume is a really cool thing. But in an untrained person, 3 sets, they're going to grow. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So that's like fairly obvious to anyone who's done any amount of training / lifting. So I think that is, kind of a non sequitur in terms of making the strong case that because in this context it didn't translate. And the second one that I can think of, although maybe you have some off the top of your head, is calories and the amount of surplus you can get away with. I think because you have more room to grow as a untrained individual, you can get away with a larger surplus, while in a person who has less to grow, you probably want to moderate the surplus just a little bit.
Even still, I'm not convinced entirely by that data.
And that is weak evidence, by the way. One. Two is that I think, and the reason why I say that is because I just experientially too, just with like really, I don't mean like, it depends on where you fall on the moderate too. Like, so like 500 or so, I'm still cool with a trained individual. But if you start getting into like some really high values, I feel like the person who has a ton of sensitivity might even be able to get away with like, sometimes absurd levels of, and still calories. Really like recomp and things like that. But I wouldn't push that hard in a trained individual. For sure. That makes sense. Yeah.
So the one trained versus untrained thing that I came up with was none of what you came up with, which is hilarious and awesome as we get so many perspectives this way. But I think another compelling thing to add to your list is the absolute effect magnitude is going to be higher. And so your ability to see the differences between groups grows substantially. Like if you barely grow anymore because you've been lifting for 25 years, motherfucker, we could give you hack squat versus leg press, but you're never going to see any differences. But if you are untrained, you grow so much from each condition that the small differences start to be able to be detectable with statistical process control. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, there is a difference here that's significant. We'd have just never seen it. It's kind of like a shitty analogy, but if you take, males and females of the same size and strength and you test them in punching power, you're going to be like, there's no difference between males and females. You're like, okay, let's just take random males and females. You're like, oh, there is a huge difference in punching power. That raw difference is a big deal for statistical detection of phenomena, because a lot of times if you test advanced athletes, the tractability of the training program is low. And they just might not have much of an effect either way. And you have all these studies come out. They're like, well, no difference between X, Y, Z or this and that. And you're like, amazing. Nothing matters.
Yeah,
I love it, which some people cling to for some reason. Like, see, it doesn't matter what you do. Like, is this why you got into science, to detect no differences between things? Yeah, but sure. Do you think that's valid? The whole absolute and relative detection thing?
Yeah, I think when you have a higher signal, you can definitely get away with also shorter studies.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So you can, I think that's a really good point. And just to piggyback off that, I think the difference between a trained and untrained person, you were talking about some like no growth in some studies in trained individuals. I think that picking someone off the street that's untrained, the homogeneity, so how similar they are, is going to be much, much truer for those individuals than trained individuals, where you get trained individuals and the studies sometimes you'll literally span from 1 year to like really, really, really trained,
15
year situation where especially if you're doing small studies, if you get a large enough sample, it's all good. That'll be washed out, normal distribution. But especially when you're doing a whole like 10 versus 10 type deal.
That's much more typical.
Yeah, exactly. You could get, just from having a little bit more well-trained in one group and the capacity for growth being much, much less in one group, that could have been the reason. So getting a more homogeneous group is, I think, more likely in untrained than when you
everyone's the same degree of untrained, more or less, unless they're lying and have lifted weights before or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What are the conclusions that you're comfortable drawing practically from this study? I'll say personally that I think this is a brilliant study that really reveals and confirms pre-understood mechanisms. It's great to see a study that says, yeah, we're onto some stuff. Things make sense. But as far as like you should do X exercise versus Y, I think that jettisons the concept of variation entirely. And so it's like, well, what about when leg curls get stale? You're like, no such thing. You're like, what? Am I supposed to do one exercise forever? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple. One is that, the reason why you do a study is sometimes in order to get at something very specific about how does this work generally. So if I work a muscle in a lengthened position, resistance curve being equal, will I get more growth? So that, I think, adds to the literature on that. Then, really cool, because they did MRI, you could also get at the different heads. Often with ultrasound, it's very hard to do. You can't, like I've say, oh, why didn't they do this before I actually used an ultrasound and got, a good amount of experience? And then you do it and you're like, oh crap, I cannot tell the difference between, exactly. So I think one takeaway is that more literature on, one, working a muscle in the lengthened position specifically, and two, the resistance curve is also added by having that short head. But then three, it also confirmed what another study showed, where it depends on the muscle. So you were talking about variation with a seated hamstring curl when they compared it to a lying hamstring curl, which is a very similar deal to the Nordic, is that there's muscles that are actually shortened and lengthened differentially depending on how you're sitting. So you have the sartorius, which crosses the knee and the hip as well, but it actually shortens or lengthens in the lying position. So you will get differential muscle growth from those two exercises, to the point where it actually makes sense to do both. Even though the hamstring is not the most lengthened, you have other muscles that are more lengthened. So variety matters.
Variety matters. So basically this is saying, like, look, all these exercises are generally robust hamstring hypertrophy exercises. Ideally, if you can get a kind of lying leg curl or prop yourself in a certain way with pads, that generates more tension at the stretch, at the longer muscle lengths, that's probably better. Mm-hmm. If you can't do that, a seated leg curl is a good look, and a Nordic curl is also a good look, but for slightly different reasons and for slightly different parts of the muscle. And lastly, you should probably be rotating all three of these in and out of your plan, or have a few of them in at the same time in a given mesocycle, because you want to get that all-around muscle growth, and each one of these hits the muscles of the lower body, hamstrings, sartorius, etc., the knee flexors, from a slightly different angle, a little bit better, a little bit worse. And so it's really good to use multiple exercises in your program, not necessarily in the same day, but better than to just try to find the one king exercise to rule them all. Agree, disagree?
Yeah, I'd say so for sure, especially when you start understanding like what's going on with the muscles. You can sort of intuit while keeping with that principle. So if the sartorius flexes the hip while the hamstring extends the hip. Yes. So if you go into neutral position, the sartorius is lengthened. So in that lying position, you're actually in that length. And so it kind of jived. It's a bunch of muscles now sort of pointing in that direction. I think oftentimes with the lengthened research, we think about what is the resistance curve of the exercise, and should that bias the lengthened position? And we think about muscles that cross two joints. Should we put that muscle in a more lengthened position and work it in that lengthened position? And I think the research, it is in untrained, actually almost all the studies in untrained, but the research is much more consistent on putting a muscle in the lengthened position and then working it there, in my opinion, than it is on choosing a resistance curve. I think both is probably a good idea in a lot of contexts, but with a consistent resistance curve, I would probably bet on putting the muscle in a more lengthened position than I would on putting the muscle in a shortened position and working it in a lengthened resistance curve.
Got it. Okay. So basically, if you have a choice, what you want to do is, let's say you have some kind of special machine that if you put your arm out in front of you, the machine is really hard to pull here, but here it gets easier. That's going to grow your biceps better than if it's just a regular cable curl with the same resistance, right? Better to have more resistance here at the bottom and less at the top, granted. But what you're saying is another way to get that lengthened relationship and benefit from it is to bring the bicep really far back, pre-stretch that muscle because it attaches to the shoulder. And then even if you have roughly the same tension here as here, that pre-lengthened means at every point it's lengthened more than usual, and then you'll get really good growth. But ideally, a combination of the two is good, or a variation of the two is good. Sometimes you do this one that's harder here, easier here. Sometimes you do that one. But if you get a free motion machine, like a spoiled rich asshole that I am, then you can get yourself on a bench, and then the bottom by leverage is both pre-stretched and the hardest, and the top is still pre-stretched but easier. And that's probably going to cause pretty decent growth.
Yeah, for sure.
Very cool. But what you don't want to do is either skip the deepest stretch part of range of motion in most cases, or use an exercise that makes the bottom stretchy part very easy and the top hard. Is that still something you agree with?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
And I think for a lot of muscles that's been shown, the only one that it hasn't been shown for is actually the bicep. But the way they compared the two was already a stretch position. So this is actually unpublished, even though it's been mentioned and I've got to speak to the author, but it was a comparison of a neutral, so arm at the side, bicep curl with the resistance going straight back, so hardest in the lengthened position.
Very tough here, easy here.
And then the bicep all the way back and also 90 degrees, so not, and they found no differences between groups, which to me suggests, and I've been sort of asking this, how long is long? So meaning you reach a certain level of length, and that doesn't mean don't do both, but, and it's one study, of course, but it seems like you can reach a level of length that covers your basis, and getting to a stupid level of length that's just uncomfortable may not be necessary.
Got it.
If that makes sense.
But if the bicep was up here, then we would love to have a study of same force curve, and then a study where it's harder here versus the bicep back there.
Yeah.
And your suspicion as a researcher and a practitioner is that getting the good old deep stretch is probably a good thing for
I think so. And there's a bit of a signal for that from other unpublished data. There's an abstract. So it's hard with all these things that are, we're in an age now where a lot of things are floating around and preprints exist and so on, that you can get inklings.
Which is great.
Yeah, which is awesome, I think.
As long as you're not taking the inklings and being like, that's it, man. We've got it. The Bible, it's written.
For sure.
This is how to do things.
Yeah.
This actually offshoots to another line of questions I have for you. It's out of order on my things to ask you, but I think I'm good enough to come back to the other thing. There are, again, two extremes in the exercise science peripheral community for this topic. I'll illustrate both of them to you, and then you let me know which one's actually closer to the truth / maybe somewhere in the middle. One extreme will basically say, yes, some research has shown that muscles at a stretched position or at a lengthened position do grow better, but it hasn't been every muscle in the human body. And so it is premature and unscientific for us to assume that muscles getting more growth when more tension is applied to them at longer muscle lengths is a near universal or universal truth for how skeletal muscles operate and grow. On the other hand, there is another perspective that says, look, like we have 3 to 5 muscles already studied, most with multiple studies. Most of these muscles are quite disparate in architecture. The biceps and the quads don't have a lot in common. If you look at the muscle just by itself, that's really different. The pennation angles are weird. Super different stuff. And in almost every case, with only neutral results being the exception and not the other way around results, longer muscle lengths do tend to promote more hypertrophy. So at this point, saying, look, it's probably true for all muscles is a much more confident assertion than either it's not true for all muscles, for which we have no direct evidence, or even the assertion of kind of like a false neutrality. Well, we just don't know. Like, come on, man. Like, if you meet, this analogy would be wrong, but like, I'll just go with it. Fuck it. If you meet like 18 guys named Chad and they're all douchebags, you meet 19th Chad and someone's like, hey, is this guy cool? You haven't talked to him yet. You're like, I'm going to guess he's not, because I've never met a single cool Chad. Look, if you're out there and your name is Chad, don't be a douchebag. I'm kidding. But if you're a douchebag, you take that joke all wrong anyway. What do you think about this situation?
Yeah, so I think some people try to be scientific to a fault, which is what you're describing, where it's like, listen,
my ex-girlfriend told me that.
So what were you doing? What were you trying to get her?
I approached physical romance as a technical endeavor. Turns out the light microscope down there was not a turn on.
Perfect. Yeah.
But I saw all kinds of stuff.
Terrible. Man. Okay.
Nightmare shit.
All right. So
it's terrible. Amoebas and shit, bro. I'm kidding. That joke went way too far.
All right. I forgot where. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, lengthen position training.
The genital likes look enormous in a light microscope, like giant carnivorous crabs.
I would imagine that's true. I've only looked at muscle cells under a microscope.
Nonsense. Come on.
But
you're just lying.
I don't know. I've gotten some urges, but I was around when they bought it, and it's very expensive. I didn't want to do anything.
Your PI brings you there. I'm like, Daniel, I don't know how else to say this. Did you put genital lice under the light microscope? You're like,
I've done a lot of bad things. I think that one would get me canned. So I don't know.
It's science.
He does like me, so
nice.
But yeah, I think that one might get me the boot. So I'll hold off on that recommendation from you.
Give it some thought. Don't write it off. Okay. All right. Actual answer.
Yes, actual answer. I think this one is interesting only because. So I'll say my stance. I think that it will continue to show that if you put a muscle in the lengthened position for most muscles, it will continue to show more gains in that position, at least neutral to positive. And the reason why I'm fine with making the recommendation is because that neutral is in there too. And if you're going to do something and you're going to get neutral to positive gains, I'm pretty sure I'm going to take that bet every single time.
Right.
So oftentimes, if you look at even the speculation is still neutral to positive, like, oh, it won't matter. Well, if something doesn't matter, and this is what we were talking about previously, where if something doesn't matter or studies show that it doesn't matter some and some show that it's positive, I'm always going to bet on doing the thing that had a signal toward positive because there's not a distinct downside, right?
It's like going to the casino, a weird casino where someone's like, okay, you can't lose. You might not win. You'll lose nothing, but you might also win. You're like, yeah, I'm just going to bet every single time. Like, who doesn't do that?
Yeah. So one interesting thing, and this is, I would consider to be hypothesis, you know, a low, not necessarily an extremely well-reasoned hypothesis, but a hypothesis is that there's certain muscles that increase in length in a way that will, and pennated muscles all fall into this category, that will increase in length, so fascicle length increases, and that fascicle length increase will manifest in a cross-sectional area increase. So there's been some modeling research where they basically showed, Hornberger recently put out a paper, and I think there's others that followed, and this isn't direct measurements, by the way, it is modeling. So the assumptions based on the geometry tell us that, and the geometry makes sense in that if you have a pennated muscle and that pennation continues downward, let's say it ends here, and then now I got a little bit more length in that fascicle, if I measure across, that's going to be an increase in cross-sectional area and an increase in thickness. So
that's the purpose of pennation from an evolutionary perspective, is to jam more muscle into the same volume.
Yeah, exactly. So, but an increase in fascicle length is actually not going to allow you to increase in force. It actually does more for shortening velocity, but that increase in length is still going to manifest in hypertrophy. It's more tissue, right? So you can measure an increase in cross-sectional area theoretically when you get that increase in fascicle length. And there's some speculation that, and I don't think this is necessarily well-founded, that fascicle length increases will plateau much more quickly than hypertrophy, normal radial hypertrophy increases. So an increase in the sarcomeres in parallel versus sarcomeres in series. So it's possible, and I consider this very, very, very speculative, but if the time course of increases in fascicle length is short, then you could potentially see a world where those untrained subjects receiving more growth from those lengthened positions is because of the fact that they got some adaptations that were related to increases in fascicle length. But there's a lot of layers to this that makes me question. So one, you have to draw the conclusion, or you have to make the assumption that all of the increase, all of the differences, which were pretty large in many of these studies, came from an increase in fascicle length. And I think that is, you know,
possible but
unlikely. Then two, you have to also, I think, make the case that the increases in strength that you see even at shortened positions.
Yes, you wouldn't get them from fascicle length increases.
Yeah, exactly.
Parallel doesn't increase strength, series doesn't increase strength. Parallel does.
Exactly. So you'd have to say, all of the increases in strength in the shortened position are coming from, you know, neural increases, and when we see them, that just seems unlikely.
It just sounds like excuse city.
Yeah, exactly.
You're just trying to caricature a situation. It's incrementally more unlikely with every single caveat you put in.
Exactly.
There. Yeah.
And then you have to assume that the fascicle length increases will truly plateau quickly, where there's mixed evidence on this, where in trained individuals and athletes and so on, you still see fairly robust increases in fascicle length.
Also, increasing fascicle length on a net aggregate will actually allow your muscle to become a quote unquote longer. And especially when a lot of the research shows that much of the hypertrophy in the lengthened position, shouldn't have said much, a good degree of the hypertrophy is in the distal portion of a muscle, kind of towards the end. Having like a longer and thicker distal quad, tricep, bicep, every muscle I can think of damn near, lat, is like, that's what makes the muscle aesthetically look just much better. You want, there's a thing in bodybuilding where some people have like short muscles, in their physique. And it's not a good look because it just looks like your muscle doesn't occupy all the space that it could there. But longer muscles typically just look better. So even if someone said, okay, this is mostly fascicle length mediated, you're not getting kind of side to side growth, you're getting basically lengthening growth, but like, I'll take that shit too. God damn it. We used to think it was impossible to make muscles longer meaningfully. Now we know it is possible. Like, maybe it's a total different type of hypertrophy, fine, but like, motherfucker, there's still money in the bank.
I'll take it.
Yeah, hell exactly,
yeah. For sure. And then the last point I'll make, which I think is a fascinating one, but may not apply to all muscles, but it definitely applies to some because we've seen it measured, is that it doesn't have to necessarily even be the fascicle itself that's getting longer if you make the assumption that lengthened training is increasing fiber length. So if we go through, so it kind of necessitates us to go through what the structure of muscle is like. So if you're willing, I can go up so basically you have sarcomere, right? So that's the smallest contractile unit. Yep. There's a bunch of, so the thick and thin filament, the myosin head is like a rod, which looks like a red ball sack on top. And
excellent. I had never heard that before, but it's accurate. Grabs
onto a pearl and it pulls the two halves together. And
Scott, has your ball sack ever grabbed anything?
I think he confirmed that. Yeah, exactly. So we got the sarcomere, smallest unit, a bunch of sarcomeres in series is a myofibril.
Yes.
Right? So you can think of that sort of as like a string of spaghetti, right?
Yep.
Then you have a bunch of those strings of spaghetti wrapped in a burrito that make up a muscle fiber.
And that's the muscle cell.
So that's one muscle cell.
Yep.
Exactly. And then that one muscle cell multiplied by a bunch is going to be a fascicle. So a bundle. So you can think of that as a mega burrito, a bunch of burritos. Ooh. Yeah, exactly. We're getting good at disgusting. Nobody's going to eat that thing. It's just spaghetti, a bunch of noodles.
Burrito.
And exactly. But the mega burrito is the fascicle, and then a bunch of fascicles would be a mega burrito. That's whole muscle. But the thing that you need to sort of grasp within this analogy is that the burrito, the muscle fiber itself, doesn't necessarily span the mega burrito. So you could have...
It almost never does.
I think it's true for pennated muscles. I think there's more spanning, but there's a bunch of muscles that have been shown and some that it's kind of murky. So for the hamstrings, I couldn't find very good evidence, even though they're pretty long muscles, but it's definitely true for the sartorius. A bunch of...
I was going to say the sartorius. There's like potentially like an 18 centimeter long cell in there.
Yeah, so it's very rare because of the fact that it has a bunch of fibers within the fascicle. Yes. So I think there's an inverse relationship between the length of the muscle and the amount of fibers it has that span. So basically, you're going to have a lot more small fibers in very long muscles because of the fact that, and this is somewhat speculation on the researcher's part from a why is this occurring standpoint, but it seems like when you have a really long muscle, in order for that signal to propagate through that long muscle from the neuromuscular junction takes a while. So instead you have a bunch of muscles that are sort of staggered, bunch of fibers that are staggered that allows you to contract a lot more quickly. So it's more of a speed thing that allows...
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and to me that seemed like really palatable. So we got the sartorius, we got the gracilis, we got some ab muscles, we have, I believe... one other muscle that's not coming to mind, but it's definitely a phenomenon that has been measured in a few different ways. Which muscles it applies to, I think, is still somewhat up in the air in terms of some of the more pennated muscles, because of the fact that it's really hard to do some of these techniques. You have to digest the whole muscle. You have to slowly tweeze those fibers out. Oh my God. So the amount of samples that you even get with some of the data in the hamstring, which, is, I think, kind of equivocal, makes me pause because of the fact that you're not sampling that many fibers.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. It could be biased there. So overall, you would say it's probably a more confident assumption that if any muscle you train, if you can apply more tension in a lengthened position, and if you can pre-stretch that muscle to get most of the muscle more lengthened, or all of it, that's a better bet with probably no downsides other than like taking entire exercises and excluding them because they don't function like that, than it is to say, look, for the muscles studied, yes, the whole stretch thing applies, But for all the muscles we haven't studied, there's just one giant question mark. We just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd say that's a fair characterization. I would put it into the category of, so you've seen sort of me go through the layers of the whole fascicle thing, and I don't buy it just yet. So what I consider it is more along the lines of, it is, one, very likely to be neutral or positive, so I'm going to hedge that direction. And two, I'm going to say that, sure, as a scientist, it's an unknown because we haven't seen the studies in the trained individuals yet. We see a couple, and this is something that I think is important too. Just because, let's say you have 15 studies in untrained, you don't need to do 15 studies in trained. You see a couple that trend in that direction. You're like, all right, this phenomena can cross over between those camps.
Sure.
So.
And we know that because almost all other phenomena have crossed over. Mm-hmm. So we say, okay, this is crossing over. It's kind of like, all right, this is a thing. Mm-hmm. Back in the day, myself and a few of my colleagues came up with the volume landmarks. The amount of volume it takes someone to maintain their muscle size. The minimum effective volume is the amount it takes to grow detectably. The maximum recoverable is the most volume you can do and still recover and continue to even maintain and maybe progress. And somewhere theoretically between the minimum effective and maximum recoverable is the maximum adaptive volume. It's a theoretical space in which you're getting your absolute best gains. You told me you have some landmarks of your own. You think you're big and bad, huh, Mr. PhD student?
I'm coming at the king because you taught me, and now the student is overcoming.
That's right. Red lightsaber time.
That's it.
Excellent.
It's
all right,
the ultimate showdown. So this is not actually a landmark as much as it is a volume landmark, as much as it is a growth landmark.
Okay.
So I have maximum growth potential, and then so the maximum amount you can grow, period, and then maximum growth for a given volume. And I think the reason why this is useful is it can be overlaid on something that is constrained. So your model, whenever you give that landmark, is constrained by something. So it's either constrained by frequency. So at this frequency, this is where that landmark would fall.
Yes.
And I think what you can do with maximum growth potential is basically say, all right, unconstrained, what can this individual do? Meaning, if this individual can only go in one time per week, you can give those landmarks, volume landmarks, but unconstrained, here's what things would look like. So let's say their maximum adaptive volume is 12 sets. If they trained a muscle group one time per week, you can say you're hitting your MAV, but you're not hitting your maximum growth potential, your MGP. So it allows you to overlay something that's specific to the actual thing that you're looking for, the muscle growth. And I think a really good example of this is Menno recently put out a post that was on creatine. And his case was that the creatine allows you to get more growth for a given volume. But if you were to do a lot of volume, because it essentially allows you to get more growth per set, because you can do more per set. But if you reach that
more reps per set.
Yeah, more reps.
Or a little bit more load with the same reps.
Yeah, exactly. But if you could do enough volume, then it might not matter. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the take, because it could be mechanisms outside of that.
Yeah. So basically, if we have the muscle growth as a cup, if you can get a bigger pore going, but you only get one pore, then the bigger pore works. But if you have multiple pores, it doesn't matter how big the pores are. You're going to, and then it fills up one way or another.
Yeah. So I think that would be a really easy way to use the maximum growth potential. You would say, okay, creatine doesn't actually change your maximum growth potential. It just lowers your maximum adaptive volume. So that's like a really easy vernacular thing that allows you to essentially always map on what's going on with those volume landmarks with what's going on with actual growth.
Okay. So a couple follow-up questions. That sounds really cool. Other than genetics, what can change, what variables in training can you change to increase your maximum growth potential?
Yeah, so a lot of these things that would fall into the category of just thinking about using maximum growth potential would be stuff that doesn't fall sometimes into the purview of training. So getting adequate sleep, certain supplements, and so on, where you would say, okay, you might actually be changing your volume landmarks with sleep, or you could not be changing them, but you're still minimizing your maximum growth potential. So it basically allows you to have a subcategory where you can talk about, okay, theoretically, a lower amount of sleep could actually lower your MAV, But regardless of what's going on with the MAV, it's now a context where your maximum growth potential is actually lower.
Yes.
So you can always overlay that so you can get the whole context of what's going on. It's obviously theoretical, just like the volume landmarks, but it always allows for that overlay.
That's a really cool concept because there are things you can do to change your volume landmarks which don't change your maximum growth potential, actually reduce it. So the sleep thing is great, and I'll use another one, which is cardiovascular exercise. So sleep, you can say, okay, your maximum recoverable volume, if you don't get lots of sleep chronically, has fallen. And concomitantly, it might be true that your maximum adaptive volume has also fallen just because the MRV goes, and that thing goes,
Mm-hmm.
You say, okay, so someone says, look, my MAV, maximum adaptive volume for, let's say, quads is like 12 sets per week with how much sleep I get. And maximum adaptive volume is the volume at which you get your best adaptations for all of the other conditions. But if you got more sleep, your maximum adaptive volume might not be 12 sets per week. It might be 14.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it turns out that now you can do more volume, or it's still 12 sets per week, but each set grows you more because instead of doing sets and then not sleeping and your body's like, are we fucking around or what are we doing? You actually get some growth going on. Another example is cardiovascular training. You can take your maximum recoverable volume for your quads and skyrocket that thing to the moon if you just start training for a marathon. I've had endurance athletes in the gym do back-to-back sets of 10 almost to failure and feel nothing whatsoever. No pump, no soreness, not any growth I could tell because they're tiny twig people, but my God, their MRV is through the fucking roof. But their maximum growth potential because of all that endurance training is an absolutely lower level. So not everything is about how much volume you can smash or how much volume you need. The maximum growth concept, it outranks the volume landmarks as an important thing to think about. Yeah, volume's cool as a means to an end, but the end in all of life is maximum muscle growth. Correct. Which means Ronnie Coleman's still king, doesn't it?
Correct. I agree wholeheartedly, especially with the last point.
Of course.
But the whole thing.
It's also impolite to disagree about Ronnie being king. And it's one of those things, like if they ask that question at the presidential debates, both candidates have to be like...
That's the one thing that crosses party lines.
That's right. Sure. They shake hands, pose with Ronnie. Ronnie could unite America. Scott, Ronnie for president?
I would love it. He's my favorite.
Everybody going to be lifting heavy ass weights starting January 6th.
That would be a start.
And don't you come to the Capitol because we doing squats.
Exactly.
No more rebellion.
I agree.
All right. Rep ranges.
Maximum growth at a given volume as well. We got the similar concept, but essentially you allow for it not having to be maximal. So you have, let's say, a different exercise. So let's say somebody decided to do only seated hamstring curl or only lying hamstring curl. Their maximum growth at a given volume could actually be higher if they choose a better exercise. So volume doesn't necessarily encapsulate the exercises necessarily.
Totally.
Yeah. So
totally.
So I think,
which is why a question like what's my MRV is unanswerable outside of a specific context.
Exactly.
It's answerable generally, but has very big deviation. So on average, it'll be 50 sets. But if you do really shortened position exercises with a low tension, you might be able to survive and need 70 sets. But if you do an exercise that really puts a lot of tension, length in position, creates a lot of damage disruption, you might need way fewer sets. It's kind of like the whole situation with comparing like a real shitty lying leg curl machine to a properly executed stiff-legged deadlift. 2 sets of 8 stiff-legged deadlift for an untrained person, you're not walking for a week.
Smashing.
Lying leg curl, you could do 4 sets and be like, I don't know, there's something happening back there. Yeah, very, very, very important. All right. Next line of questions.
Let's do it.
Rep ranges and progressing with load or reps. So we've chatted with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld before. And it was a study that I believe you were the head author of that discovered that within a certain rep range, if you increase over the weeks the number of reps you're doing to stay close to failure versus if you increase the weight a little bit but not increase the reps, that you get roughly the same muscle growth. What does that have to do with rep ranges?
Yeah, so we have ample evidence showing that you can grow from a wide variety of rep ranges. So between 5 and 30 is generally what's thrown out there. Interestingly, there's a decent amount of direct evidence that it could be slightly lower than that. 4-3, let's say you were shooting for 5 and you got 4. Do you need to do an extra set?
You're not growing 0.
Yeah,
right.
exactly. You're definitely not growing 0. And it might actually even be the same. Would I do it often for a bunch of practical reasons? No. Just in terms of lifting really heavy loads very often is not the best idea. So even if we have that direct evidence, I still wouldn't necessarily recommend it. There is one study pointing toward, it was actually Brad's study as well, pointing toward in the quad, you could get too low. So that was the one muscle that ended up growing less from that lower rep range. But in the same study, they measured bicep, tricep, and it actually grew the same amount. Yeah.
Got it. And then so for sets of 30, sets of 31 still grow muscle, and 32 and 33 and et cetera. It's just my understanding of the literature is that if you give out people the information of 5 to 30, that is the most dependable growth range for most people, most muscles, most conditions.
Yeah.
If you tell people sets of 2 or if you tell people sets of 42, there's a high probability you're going to get growth, but a lower probability it'll be your best growth. And for some people, some situations, et cetera, you might get not a ton of growth and be like, damn, I wish someone told me.
Yeah, for sure.
Correct understanding?
I think so, for sure. I think there's a glimmer of research that shows 2 things. One is that you can get too high, like 90 or so, probably not the best idea. And so
why? Do we have any idea of why? I have my own suspicions. Why do you think?
It seems that it's probably a combination of the fact that the sequestration of metabolites that occur with a certain amount of compression at given loads allows for you to get to those high threshold motor units while in the
Okay, so hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on. This is really sciencey. We got to simplify.
Yeah, okay, for sure.
When you have a lot of metabolites generated, then it becomes more difficult for the muscle to produce force. And thus the parts of the muscle that are on reserve, the big fast twitch motor units, which just smoking cigarettes most of the time, they don't do anything. When your muscle's still trying to lift the weight, tons of fucking pump and burn in there, not helping, then the big fast twitch motor units ash their cigarettes and start pulling. They start helping. They're the ones that grow the most anyway. So if we make the condition inside the muscle really painful and difficult, the muscle will have to recruit more of itself to get the job done and thus grow more. But sets of 90 are kind of like you get so much perfusion of blood flow during that time. And because each rep isn't that tough and doesn't put out so many metabolites by itself, you can get clearance of metabolites roughly as quickly as you get addition. And so you never get to that grinding point, which is exactly when the faster twitch motor units kick in. And so they're kind of just like asleep at the wheel the whole time and like, hey, slow twitch fibers, you got this? And they're like, we're good. You're like, all right, I'm just going to sit here. That's more or less one of the ideas.
That's, I think, probably the most prevailing idea, and it's most palatable to me. And we've probably experienced this. I've done some dumbass shit where I basically tried to do a drop set, and I dropped a little too much.
Yes.
And I just kept going.
Yes.
I literally gained way too many reps, and I was like, I literally ruined this set.
Like 100 for 8, 70 for 8, still going. Yeah. 60 for, or 50 for 6. So you go, all right. And you go to 30 and you get like 18.
Boom, 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 boom.
And you go to 10 and you're just like, wee.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Scott, remember we have a bodybuilder that will go unnamed that was using like 20 pounds for bicep curls on the cable? He was trying. So basically, that is probably the reason why ultra high reps, if you can't, and this is kind of a cool take home for people. Let's see if you agree with this. If during a set, you don't get to that, at least a little bit, there's no detected amount of increased force requirement, and there's no detected amount of slowdown you have to kind of go through, you might not be growing the most muscle.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway for sure. Yep.
Okay. Are there any hypothetical or research-backed differences coming back to that earlier point of rep ranges, combined with progressing through reps or through load, if I go from sets of 5 to sets of 8 with the same load over several months, versus if I go from sets of 25 to sets of 28 with the same load over a few months, versus those conditions where I don't do the rep increases, but I just make the weight heavier, low rep weight heavier, or high rep weight heavier. Is there any reason to think that breakdown of, look, it doesn't much matter as long as you're getting close to failure for progressing in reps or load? Does that seem to matter across the spectrum, or do we not have any data to suggest anything?
Yeah, so that's the reason why we ran the study. So basically, it was relatively clear to us that you could span a variety of rep ranges and stay at that rep range and get the same amount of growth. But as a tool for progressive overload, which should you reach for? Should you reach for more load, or should you hypothetically reach for more reps? And so we had 4 exercises. It was squat, leg extension, seated calf raise, and straight leg calf raise.
Okay.
And one group we tested their 10 RMs. One group only did what they did for their initial 10 RM the whole time and same weight the whole time, progressed in reps, while the other group, we kept them in the 8 to 12 rep range and really tried to get around 10, and they increased in load the whole time.
Okay.
And we got pretty much identical growth between groups. And these were trained individuals. Many of them increased strength a bit more than expected, because the way we defined trained was you hit legs, but it didn't necessarily specify the squat. So some of them got pretty strong, pretty strong in the squat. But even then, the amount of rep increases toward the end of the study, so in the reps group, was probably about 16 or so toward the end of the study. So they gained 6 reps from start to finish in the last session.
Okay.
So, reasonable amount of increase.
Yeah.
Probably not somebody that was super, super well trained, probably wouldn't have done that.
Yeah, sure.
They'd increase by 1 or maybe 2 reps, right? So it just goes to show that they weren't super, super acclimated to it. But it also gives you an idea of like how wide the reps were actually going. And for the calves, it was similar, but even slightly higher in terms of you could even get up to in the 20s or so. So
I see, and still worked.
And it still worked. Exactly.
So basically, whether you're training heavy or light, you can probably progress on either reps or load.
Yep.
Practically, it's a little tough to progress on reps when you're going heavy. Like a hard set of 5, you don't just do 6 the next day.
For sure.
But a hard set of 25, you'll probably be able to do 26 the next day. So would you agree that a practical way to employ this is it's probably better to try to progress through reps or load at lighter weights, but probably use the smaller plates to progress through load on the heavier weights?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much exactly what I do.
Right. That's what most people do. But if you can progress in reps, even at heavier weight, it's not like rep progression is some magical thing that only works at high reps. It works at low reps too. Awesome. Amazing.
I think also just in terms of practical considerations, a double progression in the rep range that makes the most sense for the exercise is usually a good idea. So have, let's say, 5 to 8 for a heavy exercise, let's say an RDL. Once you get to 8, you can drop back down, but there's nothing telling you that you can't add load as well. So basically it gives you a loose range where you're like, if I leave 8, I'm definitely increasing load, but I want to keep this exercise 5 to 8. So it's not even really a double progression. I call it a double progression, but really what I do is I'll prescribe different rep ranges to different exercises, ones that make sense for that exercise. So I'm probably not going to do super high rep squats and so on.
Right,
so,
for very good reason.
Yeah, but I'll reach for load a lot more often, something like that. But I'm happy to, hit 8 or even 10 on the squat, but I'm not going to go to like a 15.
Right, because then it's cardio is keeping you back instead of, or lower back stuff.
Lower back, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Here's a trippy line of questions. Apparently there is a recent study that tested training beyond failure. Now, my high school principal told me I was one of the illustrious students that went beyond failing school. I was that bad at it. What the hell is beyond failure? How do we even contextualize that? What was the study? What did it find? Tell us the story.
Yeah, so I think just as a preface going into just the failure literature in general, I think is somewhat useful. So
You're talking about my life story.
Yeah, exactly. You can fail in a whole lot of different ways, right?
Unlimited Failure, my new book, out in March.
Exactly. So because of the fact that exercises have different resistance curves, there's actually an unlimited amount of ways to fail and where you'll fail.
Yes, failing here, failing here, failing here.
Yeah, exactly.
Failing here.
Yeah, that's that one hits the hardest.
Oh,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah. We fail in the gym so we don't have to fail out in the real world.
But then
There's
you still
something
fail in the real
cheesy
world.
Like that.
Like,
exactly.
I have failing everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So typically the way failure is operationalized in the literature is somewhat squirrely, honestly, because of the fact that we have something called volitional failure, which usually means that the person believes that they couldn't do another rep with good form. And then you have true concentric failure, true concentric task failure, which is somewhat of a corollary to form failure. And the reason why I say that that gets a little bit murky is that depending on the degrees of freedom that you allow for the individual, concentric failure and form failure really mean the same thing. Because let's say you're doing a bicep curl. If you were to keep strict form the whole time, you would just fail right about here and then go down. But if you allowed the person to do a whole bunch of swinging and so on, they've really failed. The task
is get this to this. You got Olympic weightlifting shit going on.
Exactly.
I don't love that definition of failure.
Yeah, exactly. So I think using the form which was prescribed and saying concentric failure is a lot more consistent.
Yes. And we don't care where in concentric failure. If you cannot complete the next repetition, you're done.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So, and then just generally speaking, so I can paint the picture for this beyond failure, generally speaking, you can keep a few reps in reserve, 1, 2, and get similar amounts. So a recent study, Ruffalo and colleagues did a really good job of elegantly showing this, where they did leg press, leg extension within subject design. The leg press was 2 reps in reserve, so 2 reps from failure. Leg extension, 1 rep in reserve. Other leg went to failure. No differences between groups. Generally, the literature points this way.
Yes.
So now this study comes along, and I'll describe the design. They did also within subject design. These were untrained subjects, and it was a calf raise. So they had one leg do calf raises to task failure, and so generally that's at the top. So if you can't reach the top of a calf raise, you're done. You're
the annoying lockout portion. Yeah. The hardest part of the calf raise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the other group, which they called the dorsiflexion failure group, which basically just means that they kept going until they literally couldn't move the load. So let's say you're doing a calf raise, you're doing a calf raise, you're doing a calf raise, you can't reach the top anymore. You start doing that, and then you're at the bottom and you can't move at all.
Okay, so another way to define it is Group 1 could not complete a concentric repetition. Group 2 went so much further, they couldn't start a concentric repetition.
Exactly.
You've gone to super failure, especially on like lengthened machines. Someone's like, do more flies. And you're like,
you're done.
And they're like, try harder. You're like, dude, you don't understand. Trying harder doesn't mean I get to here and then quit. This is it.
Exactly.
Yikes. What a painful study to put people through. Did they have a cattle prod?
Yeah, I think they had tasers. It was a very...
Did they tase the people to get the electric current to get them more calf raises, or was it more of a threat? Like, if you don't keep going...
No, they didn't want to ruin the study design, so they tased them in the neck, not in the calf. That would throw things off. Sense. Yeah, you got to keep the consistency.
The IRB will just let any study get published nowadays.
For sure, yeah.
All right, and then let me ask you a quick question. What was the volume of training that they employed offhand?
It was a moderate volume. I don't actually remember offhand the exact amount of sets, but it wasn't a terribly
nothing crazy.
Yeah. If I had to guess, it was probably 2 times a week for probably 5 sets per session.
3 to 6 sets, something like that.
Exactly.
Got it. Yep. How most people don't even train calves because most people don't train calves.
Exactly.
Watch this. Hey, Scott, how much calf volume do you do per week?
Like 6 sets.
All right. That's pretty good, man.
Yeah.
Calves are so hard to justify training in your own mind because you're supposed to be training them, but you don't give a shit. But other people will critique you for having small calves. Mm-hmm. It's like brushing your hair when you wake up. Like, I don't care how my hair looks, but I have to go to work and they care.
Yeah, I think social media did this where I think just making fun of calves became a meme.
Yeah.
And now we just all begrudgingly train calves.
I don't want to become a meme.
I think we should just agree that nobody cares about calves.
A little silent handshake.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's how most Illuminati meetings go. They're like, no calves, right? I'm like, fellas, I love being around you.
Exactly.
The Vanderbilts are there. It's great. All right. What do they find?
More growth in the beyond failure condition, which going back to the literature on failure, people lost their minds. They're like, wait, if you can get similar growth from failure versus non-failure training, what the heck is going on here? They went well beyond failure. Well, I think there's two considerations there. One is considering the position. So you have the top of a calf raise where you fail, and then you have the other group, which was accumulating a whole lot of hypertrophic volume in that more stretch position. And we actually have
many more reps in that stretch position.
Many more, yeah.
If you assume that the bottom third, which I think is reasonable based on all the studies now, that the bottom third of the rep does a much bigger proportion of the total growth stimulus. If you like add 5 bottom third reps to a set, that's like the equivalent of 3 or 4 more reps total. And if you add 8, that's like 6 more reps. Like that's a very different amount of total volume at that point.
Yeah. So the two considerations there that I think people had a hard time conceptualizing is, one, you're accumulating more volume in a more hypertrophic position. But two,
more volume.
You're accumulating much more volume to the point where I would consider this more of an intensity technique than I even would consider it something like a straight set. Like it's just a completely different concept. Over time, if you lost 1 rep here or there by leaving a few reps in reserve, your total volume load is usually fairly similar because of the fact that you're more fatigued for the next set and so on, where it kind of all washes out. But in this context, it's much, much different. It's more similar to a drop set, where if you did, 3 drop sets, the accumulation of stimulus is just different.
And so it's a combo of two things. One is just much more volume, but also it's much more volume at the most growth promoting end of the range of motion.
Yeah, for a muscle that honestly has been shown to be by far the most, like the poster child for
stretch sensitivity, because you can stretch the shit out of a fucking calf. Amazing. So practical takeaways from this for me is like, if you have an exercise on which the failure point is in that top end of the contraction, it might behoove you to do some integrated partial reps at the end of the set. So pull downs or pull ups, as many reps as you can get. Let's say you're going to failure that day, or even 2 reps in reserve. As many reps as you can get touching the bar to your chest or getting the chin above the bar. And then another 2 reps in reserve set after like a second of rest still in the machine of like pulling your way halfway up or a third of the way up. Agree? Disagree?
Yeah, I think that's super reasonable for basically things that have a resistance curve that you're failing in the shortened position. Doing some extra reps in that position, I think, is a good idea. Either as integrated within a set or as afterwards. I think one really interesting question, at least for the calf, is, do you even need to do that top portion?
Right.
Somewhat open question. I think I've heard Jared say this, where not doing the top portion sort of feels like not getting your birthday cake or something. Like it feels like something's incomplete, and I kind of agree with that. There is some just nostalgia.
It's great for tracking too.
Yeah, that's
true. When you're at the top. I will say recently I've started training calves such that my failure point I count as about the halfway point. I guess an interesting way to do that study, if that study, and I don't mean to critique the study authors, excellent study, shows us a ton. If you wanted to truly design a study to test past failure condition, you would assign failure as whatever all the way to the end of can't move. And then you would make both groups do that, and one would stop at 2 reps in reserve of that, where the other group would still do it. So there's no range of motion differences or anything like that. But then, if they did that study, they would just find more or less the same shit we've always found, which is like, 2 RIR is fine. But this way, what they found was that for some exercises, partial reps at the end of a set essentially can meaningfully impact growth results. The only thing I'm thinking is, you got to consider tracking. Not a big deal because halfway is pretty easy to tell. The other big thing you have to consider is fatigue, especially psychological fatigue. Just something to throw out there into the wind. We'll see what your take on this is. When you do a set to failure and that set is lockout failure on the calves, it's tough. You got to really fucking try. But a set to total failure, inability to begin the concentric, which is technically at that point even eccentric failure, that takes something much more out of you. Like the people going all the way to can't move failure, there's only so many sets like that. Now for calves, not a huge deal.
Yeah,
Forearms, not a big
that
deal.
Would be my,
Nobody training their quads like that, man. You know what I mean?
For sure.
So is that something that you would recommend to people do out in the wild, or would you recommend it and say, look, try it, but see if it doesn't fuck you up super bad? What do you think?
Yeah, I think for certain muscles, I think it's okay. So I think lateral raises, I've been really playing around with that. Doesn't really mess me up too much. I get to that like sort of, 25-degree angle at the end of the set. And I almost feel like it's incomplete if I do the full. I get a much better sensation. So sometimes at the top where I can't, it's just so hard at the top.
Yes.
Where it just feels incomplete almost.
Yes.
Similar to a row where it's just like I could get so much more juice out of here, where finding a standardized mid-range there, not like can't move at all, which would be absurd, especially for a lateral raise, because obviously there's no load and you'd have to like move like a centimeter and you'd not recommend it.
3 minute long set. You're just confused the whole time.
Exactly. So I'd say use exercises that are just generally less, especially psychologically fatiguing. But overall, I would also, just based on the results of other studies. So one study actually directly looked at partial calf raises. So Cassiano did partial bottom, partial top versus full. And partial bottom grew substantially more than both conditions, and full grew more than partial at the shortened position. So the fact that you saw pretty substantial growth from that lengthened position in the calf, to me suggests that, one, do some volume, and I think it's sort of in line with what you're doing, where you're stopping sort of at that like midway point. And then also integrate some of that standardization. So basically I'll have half the sets where they'll go all the way and then stop in the middle, and then half the sets where it's you stop in the middle and then you go back down. So basically half partials and half full, ending in like a flat position. Yeah.
That's awesome. All right. Next question. You good so far?
Sweet. Yeah. Chilling.
All right. Scott, we doing good?
This is excellent. That one's going to crush.
That one's going to crush. There are a variety of groups of people, let's just say in the United States, that didn't have full access to truly de facto all civil rights. Females, all minorities, LGBTQ folks. Nowadays, that's 10 trillion times better than ever. Pretty much almost everyone has all equal rights and stuff like that. Except for one group of people to whom, off camera, Daniel low-key told me he just doesn't like these people. And he does not think they should even be. Cannot confirm. These people, Daniel said to me, should not be allowed to use public transportation. Definitely no voting. And this is tough to say. Scott, this is a bit weird to say on this channel. It's going to get political. People that use the seated calf raise, they're just not welcome in our great country. Daniel, why did you tell me that? Can you paint us a scientifically backed picture?
Yeah, so I think this all started in my childhood. Where no, definitely not my childhood, but maybe like early teens, where I was subjected to watching individuals just like ride the calf machine.
It's a ride.
So,
it's a ride. Yeah, you get your tendons in there. They do all the work. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So
8 plates on a side.
I was truly traumatized by that, where even before the science came in, I was like, I am not getting on that ride. So that's, I think we can end it right there. But that's
yeah, so you go to Six Flags, there's like roller coaster, merry-go-round, seated calf race.
Exactly.
What's that? Like, oh, it's like a thing you do yourself. Like, will it grow muscle? Like, Ooh, well, no.
Yeah, exactly. So
what's up with the seated calf raise? Why is it getting less love now?
Dive in. Now it's getting less love for sure, and I think rightfully so, given the recent evidence. So,
see, I told you guys he's a fucking anti-seated calf guy. Unbelievable.
Unfortunately,
their children shouldn't be allowed to go to school and join the camp.
Yes, exactly.
Put those seated calf people into a camp. Is that cool to say or not, Scott? Are we getting canceled for that?
I think we're part of
two Jews on the podcast.
Exactly.
All good, fellas. All good.
I think we get the pass on that one. Exactly. So, two studies. One, which this is a context where untrained individuals are actually super useful. So they did within subject design. One group did straight leg calf raises.
What is within subject design? Tell the folks what that means.
Yeah. So basically that's just one leg or one arm. In this case, one leg is assigned to one condition
to do one thing.
Exactly. And the other leg is assigned to another condition
See which one's better.
Exactly.
Genetics is completely obviated. Motivation is completely obviated. Nutrition, lifestyle, training history. It's a really awesome way of studying things.
Yeah, for sure. So it accounts for a whole lot, especially for hypertrophy literature.
Yes.
For strength, it can get a little murky just because there's a crossover effect and so on. But for hypertrophy, a whole lot of good there. So untrained individuals, one leg straight leg calf raise, one leg seated calf raise. And what they found was pretty damning for the seated calf raise, where the straight leg condition grew the gastroc a whole lot. So the outer head.
Big meaty part of the calf.
Yeah, exactly.
The diamond looking thing.
Yep, on the outside. On the outside. So whole lot of growth, somewhere around 15% growth in the straight leg condition. And then for the soleus in the straight leg condition.
The deeper, stringier, smaller muscle underneath.
Yeah. It's actually a pretty big muscle, but it
you
is
can't see
definitely it is definitely underneath. And they found for the straight leg condition about, I think it was like 3% growth. But then you move over to the seated condition and almost no growth for the outer gastroc.
Why?
It seems that the shortened position is just not as hypertrophic. So shortening that gastroc and reducing the leverage and getting less stretch in that position is just not very hypertrophic.
Yep. And you do that because the gastroc crosses the knee. As soon as you bend the knee, the gastroc's like, I don't have anything to pull against. What the hell am I here for?
Yeah. So that's the major hypothesis on that front. But interestingly, and this is threw some people for a loop, including myself, honestly, even though I was already in the camp, of course, but the soleus grew about the same amount.
Ooh.
Yeah, so no benefits.
Yes. Let me tell the folks why this is important. It's important because these disgusting, degenerate seated calf people used to have their one bullshit little excuse, Like what purpose do orcs serve in the Lord of the Rings universe? Well, at least they fight wars and stuff, I guess, right? But the seated calf people used to say, okay, the gastroc, not great to hit with seated calves, but seated calves target the soleus because it doesn't cross the knee, so it's good for that, right? And it turns out it might not even be better for that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like if you have like two friends, one of them is super good looking and rich and funny, and the other one's just funny, but no funnier than the other friend. You're going to be hanging out with the one friend more, especially to get free shit because he's rich. That's how friendships work, right?
I thought so. That's the only reason I choose friends. Just line up their net worth and pluck people off. Yeah,
that's it.
Exactly.
That's like a third question you ask in a hangout. You're like, so what's your net worth? They're like, what? Well, what's a wrong answer? So basically what you're saying, Daniel, is we have a situation where with a standing calf raise, you get it all. And with a seated calf raise, you get the same growth for the soleus, but almost no growth for the gastroc. So it begs the question of why the fuck you would ever do a seated calf raise. Do you find any compelling reasons to do a seated calf raise?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, I was previously in that camp that is just, now shouldn't be considered at all, that I thought that the soleus might get a bit more growth from that seated position. Now that one study in untrained individuals showed that the gastroc is basically getting no growth, which is, super weird, and same growth. And these are people who are very primed for growth, obviously.
They
and
have
even
to
in
grow.
them,
Right.
that was shown. So I think I would consider that even higher evidence than in trained folks.
Yes.
So huge strike. And then a replication study recently in trained individuals out of my previous lab, Brad, showed basically directionally the same thing. So now 2 studies showing essentially the same concept, where basically the seated calf raise just needs to go to the garbage for multiple reasons. We put it behind the barn, we take some kerosene, light them on fire, stop stealing plates from other machines.
Yes, everyone's got 800 fucking plates. And I think I had a weird interaction a few days ago. I parked my gold Lexus outside of a store. Every component is gold. Very difficult to make a machine run well, but they did it. You pay people enough money to do all kinds of crazy shit. And there's this homeless gentleman in the street, and I got out my wad of hundreds to try to help him sort his life out.
Naturally.
But I was like, what, did you used to have a job? And he's like, yep, I used to make seated calf raise machines. Daniel, I put my wad of hundreds back into my man bag so fast.
That was good.
And honestly, I looked at him with the look that tells him, you're just not welcome here. He was gone later that day. And I don't care where he went.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with your actions. 100% aligned.
Researcher Daniel Plotkin confirms homeless people
hates homeless people and does and loathes seated calf raise almost as much.
Almost as much.
Yeah. Not good.
So what about variation? Because you could say, look, you get tired of doing standing. I can't even say it without laughing. You get tired of doing standing calf raise, of which there are 18 trillion versions anyway. Yeah. Should I throw in a seated calf raise every now and again just to kind of ride the old roller coaster? It reminds you of childhood.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, if you would ask my former PI/mentor, Brad, he would say it's a little bit premature to discount seated calf raises completely, because there was a minor amount of increase comparatively
in the soleus.
I'm not sure that I necessarily would do that just because of my, visceral disdain for the seated calf raise. But you could make the argument that if somebody was just dying for gains and they had so much, like they didn't care about any other muscle group too, they just had so much available volume and they just really wanted to grow their calves, you could throw it in there. I'm all right with that. But otherwise, variation for the sake of variation is not warranted. I would say definitely stick to variations that could net you more. And I think that there are tons of variations where you could do partial rep ranges, stop at very specific positions. You could even, there's some data on this, Nunez, I think 2020, where you could turn your feet out, turn your feet in, and get
calf raises off the leg press, single leg calf raises with a dumbbell, double leg with a weighted vest, calf machine, but straight leg is best.
Yeah. I think what's cool also with the single leg is that, at least for me, my legs are kind of weird because I've, one stance all the time with wrestling. You sometimes develop some weird imbalances there. So I have one calf, for whatever reason, that is much less flexible than the other. So one benefit of doing single leg calf raises is that you can actually really drop into that stretch.
Yes. So otherwise, it just won't get us jacked.
Just one leg is getting the stretch.
Yes, I have the same thing. Maybe it's because we were Jewish and we were born broken or something like that.
It's possible. We can't rule it out. As scientists, we gotta search
for the truth.
Exactly.
Except for the seated calf raise, which, like you said, needs to be burned. It's a piece of metal though, so you finish burning it, it looks roughly the same. You're like,
yeah, somebody might still try to use it. One of those cult members. Yeah, it wouldn't be good.
Scott, can you imagine a totally burnt out seated calf raise? You put it in a gym and some bro comes up to it. He's like, fuck, and starts putting plates, and they're like, no, there's not even a seat pad on there.
Yeah. I mean, those people are so bad that honestly, they would just hoist an individual onto their legs just to keep doing their seated calf raises. So there's nothing stopping them. So.
Unspeakable. Exactly. Unspeakable. Yeah. Excellent. I love that. All right. Next question, Scott. The thumbnail title for this, just have a giant X over a seated calf raise machine, says useless.
That's exactly what's going to be. But I have the title tentatively as the seated calf raise officially sucks.
Officially sucks. Science : fuck the seated calf raise. I love it. You want to train right to gain muscle, but there's so much complexity to it. What exercises to choose, what sets and reps to do, how much weight to lift, and how to structure your weekly plan. So much uncertainty that it's easy to get overwhelmed. The RP Hypertrophy app removes all uncertainty and makes the training process precisely defined. Choose your pre-made workout plan from dozens available in the app, plug in your weights, and the app takes care of the rest for months of productive training. Ready? Click on the link in the description of this video to get started. What the hell is neuromechanical matching? I've went through a lot of school and I've never seen it taught in school. Is this a hypothetical thing that happens? What is it? Please let us know.
Yeah, so basically it's a hypothesis. It's one of many hypotheses as to how a muscle is chosen for a given action. But generally speaking from just a biomechanics standpoint, it's one of many factors that goes into how a muscle is chosen. And that one factor that's considered within neuromechanical matching is the leverage that a muscle has in order to essentially move the bone. So you could think about leverage as essentially just moment arms, which is the perpendicular distance between the line of pull and the axis of rotation. Yeah. And the way you can envision that is if I wanted to push my hand here, I would push in order to get the best leverage at a 90-degree angle, right? Yes. And I would also push the furthest away from the axis of rotation, so that being my shoulder. So if I wanted the greatest moment arm, I would push here, and I would push at a 90-degree angle.
Yes.
So the way muscles are situated is that some muscles that cross two joints have better leverage in different positions
than the other muscle that crosses two joints.
Exactly.
So a good example would be some of the musculature of the forearm flexors, which doesn't have anything to do with forearms. The forearm is considered a limb there. So muscles that do this, that flex the elbow, some of them, when they're at this 90-degree position, are really well leveraged, some okay leverage. Some muscles at this completely extended position have very poor leverage, where others still have decent leverage. So if I train a muscle just from here to here, the neuromechanical matching folks would be like, yeah, that's a nice try, but you're really going to be recruiting other muscles that have great leverage there, because even though, stretch under load works, if the muscle is so poorly leveraged there that your body's like, dude, that's not going to do anything, it's not going to activate it as much. That muscle won't generate as much tension, and thus it won't get as much growth. That's kind of the idea, yeah?
Yeah, that's the general premise, that the muscle that's best suited for the action from a leverage standpoint is going to be the one that's chosen by the nervous system. That's literally the whole thing for neuromechanical matching.
Okay, so the neuro part just means the nervous system turns it on. It's not some kind of esoteric thing. Do you find compelling evidence for this in the research literature?
Yeah, so it's a kind of a loaded question in terms of how do you actually even confirm that? And the reason why I say it is because there's so many factors that go into which muscle is chosen for a given action, and layering all of those is not an easy task by any means. So if you start from the micro level and you go up to the macro level, there's tons of consideration. So if you say which muscle is the best for an action in terms of efficiency, you can talk about where a muscle is on the length tension relationship. So the way a sarcomere works is that the thick filament in the middle stays in the middle, and then the thin filaments that surround it, they slide back and forth. And if there's more interaction between the thick and the thin, more overlap, then you get more tension. So you could have muscles that are on different portions of that length tension relationship, and it would be less efficient, quote unquote, to work a muscle in a position that was very shortened, for example, because
shit bunches up. Yeah. So the basic idea there is like if you curl from here to here, there's the sarcomere is so shortened, there's just not a lot happening anymore, and you don't generate a lot of force. If you curl from here to here, it's so spread apart, there's very little overlap, and you don't get a lot of force. But here to here, you get all the fucking meat and potatoes. That depending on the muscle, here could be the most meat and potatoes, here or here, anything in between. And that's muscle specific.
Yeah, there will be a passive component for some muscles, and there's even controversy around this. Where does the passive actually start? Some people believe that it's past optimal overlap, but others especially because there's some data in heart muscle and some speculation. It's really hard to measure these things, so knowing with certainty is an issue. But the passive tension could actually start even earlier than we would think in terms of, all right, you have maximal overlap, but also the beginnings of some passive tension as well. So there's a whole lot of factors here. I pointed out just to say there's a whole lot of unknowns at this level.
Tons of unknowns.
And then you climb upward and you're like, okay, how about the length of the muscle? So when you do an action, the length of the muscle matters because the shortening velocity can be higher with longer muscles. So, I mean, we've seen people fail on different lifts and people fail at different velocities. So which muscle is chosen for a given task, especially as it gets more complicated, is not only going to be indicative or indicated by the muscle's leverage, but probably factoring in the velocity component as well. So that's another factor that would need to be considered within that model. Sure. If you were even granting that we're looking for maximal efficiency.
Sure.
And then you could also talk about the issues with all of the measurements here, but you can think about how fatigue plays into the role with the nervous system over time between sets as you get closer to failure and so on.
So as the nervous system becomes more fatigued, and as the muscle becomes more fatigued, it might, in many cases, be like, all right, the nervous system, like, fuck it, just recruit everything, I need help. Versus like if you do that sub-maximally, if you just sets a 5 with your 20 RM, you may get very different activation patterns. But if you get real close to failure, the nervous system might be like, dude, everything goes, fuck it, and then everything grows.
Yeah, so I think it's still, you could conceive of a world where the climbing of, so if you just imagined muscles need to reach a sort of threshold of stimulus within a set in order to achieve growth, one muscle might end up a little higher at the finish line. Yes. If it was really leveraged / all the other components too. You can't look at leverage in isolation. You would say all of those things going on, including, and this is the most important part, we talked about all of these biomechanical factors from micro to macro that could be at play. And one that I didn't mention that's extremely important is the size of the muscle itself, or more accurately, it'd be the physiological cross-sectional area. So the amount of the muscle that can actually do that pulling. You could have a muscle that's less well leveraged, but is absolutely enormous, that obviously when it's all missions a go, you're gonna
like a world's strongest man using one arm to do tug of rope against an 8-year-old. Like, okay, he's just one arm, who gives a shit, he's still gonna win.
Yeah, exactly. So it's another factor that you need to consider, where the reason why I'm not a huge fan of using neuromechanical matching to make every decision as it relates to hypertrophy is because, one, there's so many things that go into actually choosing the muscle that's best for the task, that biomechanists use models where they optimize. It's called an optimization model, where they try to optimize for different things, where sometimes they'll optimize for efficiency, but because there's discrepancies between what biomechanists believe should be the right optimization. So you can either optimize for fatigue, you can optimize for efficiency, you can even optimize for things like, there's something called a jerk factor, which you want smooth contractions, you don't want acceleration. So like the third derivative, you don't want that acceleration to create jerky movements.
Right.
So there's a ton of things that you could account for, where all of these models, and these biomechanists, by the way, they're super, super clear that these are models and they're tentative and they might work in certain tasks. And they usually are talking about tasks that are not maximal, lifting type tasks that we're doing in the gym, where you have a whole bunch of people that dedicate their whole life to try to figure out how the nervous system is actually choosing which muscle is actually going to be activated. And they seem to have a whole lot of uncertainty about, one, whether optimization models are even the right way to go. There's many camps.
It's a huge assumption that the human nervous system has. You get an assumption that evolution has taken us to some degree of optimization, but maybe not all the way to optimization. The human body does all kinds of shit that's just kind of fucking backwards. And you're like, well, if the human body is kind of fucking backwards, you're going to have to train to reflect that. You're not an optimized model. You could be close, but you could be far. My question for you really quick is there any actual direct measurement, neurological evidence of this kind of thing going on?
Yeah, so you do see in certain actions where if a muscle is, basically the way I see this is that if a muscle, it's all a spectrum. So if a muscle is very obviously the right answer from an efficiency standpoint, I wouldn't be surprised. It is one of many factors and potentially an important factor that does contribute to whether that muscle is going to get chosen. So when you look at intramuscular EMG for certain things that, all right, even this pocket within this muscle actually really like excels at doing this action, and it does get more excitation than other areas of the muscle. So there's something to the phenomenon for sure, but applying it broadly is where issues start to form, especially, and this is the most important part, because two very, very important things. One, a lot of the assumptions on what the leverages actually are, and literally every single thing that I mentioned, are based on measurements that are on fairly shaky ground with cadavers, with using what's called the tendon excursion method. So this, I'm talking specifically about measuring the bowman arm. So measuring leverages.
Yes.
If you even just look, you don't have to be, so I'm not a biomechanist. What I like to do, and I believe what you like to do, is what can I learn from this group of people and apply to my training? And so I dive in as much as is needed in order to try to get those golden nuggets. And to me, it's very, very clear from speaking to many biomechanists and just looking at these models and looking at the actual moment arm data that there's so much variation within the actual measures from different groups of researchers for much of the moment arm data that even if you were trying to base your decisions on which muscle is the most leveraged for a given task, you'd have to consider so many things, including the fact that a lot of these things are on shaky ground and also very hypertrophied muscles. Andrew Vygotsky actually has a model of like what would happen when you get smaller or bigger. That changes.
They raise up off the bone. The insertion of the tendon is now different, or the origin, it's technically origin insertion. The height, so if we have like a bone and we have there's skinny muscle here, the aponeurosis ends like, let's say, a centimeter above my hand here. But if you have a really hypertrophied muscle, the aponeurosis starts/ends higher, and then it enters the leverage point differently, and then that means the muscle size is a huge factor, potentially in some cases making bigger muscles objectively even better leveraged, sometimes the other way around.
Yeah, the glute would probably be a great example where like at that bottom position of whatever, a leg press squat, or if you have a really small glute, it almost like seems like it's like flush, but then when you have a really meaty glute, I mean, that can like pull, so obviously factors that wouldn't be seen in a cadaver who's usually, 75 years old. Probably not.
Cadavers are very deflated, both because they lack most intramuscular water at that point, and because they're usually very sarcopenic old people. And cadavers are disturbing to work with.
Yeah, I've been exposed, fortunately, because, you get to see a whole lot of cool stuff. But yeah, it's definitely a hard line.
It doesn't look like real muscles in a textbook cross-section picture.
For sure. Yeah.
I remember in anatomy, the cadaver instructor would try to open up the skin and show us like the sartorius and stuff. And I was like, that's what that looks like? And they're like, yeah, and a dead 78-year-old.
For sure.
I don't know what I'm learning here, really.
Yeah. So for sure, you need to question all of the things up that ladder. And then the most important line of questioning would be, okay, taking all of this and all of that uncertainty and then applying it to something that's actually different. So asking which muscle is called upon by the nervous system is one thing, but then asking which muscle is going to hypertrophy is a slightly different question because of the fact that there could be things going on that are independent. So it could be that a given position, because of what's going on with some of the mechanosensing proteins, is more hypertrophic at a requisite amount of activation, but still the hypertrophic signaling has an independent aspect that is not being modeled at all because you're just thinking about, all right, what's going to go
Pulleys
on
and
with...
levers.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to layer on another whole bunch of uncertainty, especially when you have a ton of evidence that makes you start questioning, makes you start scratching your head. So a recent study looked at BFR, so blood flow restriction training versus regular, 10 rep training, same exact exercises. It was RDLs, and I believe a seated hamstring curl, and they found distinctly more growth in, I believe, the semitendinosus, so one of the hamstring heads, in the heavy load condition, and the semimembranosus in the BFR condition. Those are the same muscles, the same leverages. Like, obviously there might be something else going on that is just not being accounted for. And we talked about the seated calf raise before. Like, if the gastroc's doing less work, wouldn't you kind of expect the soleus to grow more?
Right.
But it doesn't.
So you just accomplish fewer reps.
Yeah. So what is going on in those contexts is a huge question mark that's not solved by just broadly using one,
neuromechanical matching.
Yeah, one, basically, I mean, you're literally just, neuromechanical matching is saying leverage, period, is the thing that, and I just question whether, one, should you use that only, which in my opinion you shouldn't. There's tons of other mechanical factors. And just to sort of appeal to authority, the person who termed neuromechanics was Roger Inoka, so a legend in the...
Legendary. Textbooks and everything.
Yeah, his most recent textbook and all of his previous textbooks, no mention of neuromechanical matching. It's just not a principle that there's obviously tons of stuff about leverages in there. It is a factor that could be important in certain contexts, but we need the studies to confirm when, where, how does it interact with all of the other factors.
That makes sense. I'm going to tell you, Daniel, a kind of heuristic approach I use in my own training and with folks I'm interacting with that I think accounts for some of this. And you let me know if it's just total bullshit. So let's take the pec fly, for example. At a certain level, you're getting this ball or pec stretch and you can feel your pecs a ton. At a certain level below that, when the line of pull for the pecs is like behind the bone or whatever, my biceps, I feel a lot. The strength drop off, it's insane. I can do the 70s from here to here. Down there, it's like the 20s or something. But I actually don't even feel my pecs really generating a lot of tension. So for me, I try to put muscles at long muscle lengths. And as long as I can still feel the muscle getting either tons of passive tension, tons of active tension, or both, I'm like, okay, this is great, good to go. But if you get into such an extreme range of motion that I don't even feel strong anymore and my muscle just feels like it's totally out of touch, then I'm like, yeah, I don't know if this part's really training the pec much anymore. So maybe not a whole lot is happening. Is that like a bereft of all other lines of evidence? Is that a decent thing to integrate?
Yeah, I think that is like a natural way to say that, like, this concept will apply to that case and also a lot of other cases where it's sort of obvious. Like a seated row is probably a good example where, you get up to about this point. If you try to go like crazy way back, you actually could get a whole lot of, but you start feeling it in the upper back a whole lot.
Yes.
So if you're trying to go like super lat dominant, you'll stop right here.
Yeah.
If you're trying to get like the
lats
combination,
don't do much after that, and you can feel that they don't do much.
Yeah, exactly. So
that probably takes care of most of the neuromechanical matching stuff, and it's probably we don't have to go to cadaver models. What do you think about, as far as strength of the evidence, neuromechanical matching against stretch under load? Like, which one, if someone's like, look, on my inferential neuromechanical matching, I would say it's best to train the triceps in the mid-range of motion and not at the super lengthened portion. But we look at the data and we're like, okay, lengthened actually seems to be better. Do you think like one of those takes precedence over the other, or what?
Yeah, it seems that at least with current evidence, there are some obvious cases that do lean in favor of stretch in non-intuitive ways that don't really comport with neuromechanical matching. So the problem is that you have to accept some of the models of where you believe that the leverage is actually the highest. So even answering that question is very hard because of the fact that you have layers of uncertainty of what's actually going on.
So when someone says the triceps are best leverage in the mid-range, you're like, even that might not be true.
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely certain muscles where I'm not confident just from speaking to and seeing the differences in the studies between groups in terms of researchers actually looking at this. I'm not confident that that is truly across individuals. And even like, so some studies will look at males, females, and then find different, could it be the size? Could it be something else? Where it's hard to answer the question because of the fact that you have to question the actual veracity of this muscle is best leveraged in this specific position.
Yeah.
But a lot of the speculation, for example, is that the glute is better leveraged in the shortened position. But you had a study from Mayo and colleagues that did partial range of motion, multi-hip exercise, and then a full range of motion, multi-hip exercise, and they gained more from the partial range. So
Stretched partial.
the stretched partial. So that, question mark there. Then you have the same group doing a behind the back curl, so like on an incline. So basically dumbbells versus preacher curl. So dumbbell incline curl versus preacher curl, and they grew more in the proximal part of the bicep. And the theory around the neuromechanical matching theory around the biceps brachii.
Please don't call it a theory.
Yeah, definitely not a theory. Yeah, that's why I put
possibly notion.
That's why I put it. I put that for sure in there. Is that the biceps brachii is best leveraged in the lengthened position, but the mid range is where it's hard for a behind the back curl, just resistance curve wise.
Yes.
And it grew more in the position where you wouldn't expect it to, that mid range, as opposed to a preacher curl where it's hardest at that lengthened position. So that question mark again, in terms of if you were to guess just based on at least the models that we have in terms of leverage, you'd at least scratch your head and say, all right, what else is going on?
Sure.
And basically, I'm willing to accept it in certain contexts if the evidence
it almost certainly happens, but it's so complex as to how it happens that our assumption of, well, do it like this, we're like, it's actually not certain why you would do it like this.
Yeah.
And then I guess when put up against something way more dependable, like stretch under load's probably the better bet. Or put another way, if you have someone saying, look, this muscle, don't train it under a stretch, don't leverage it so that it's hardest at long muscle lengths, do this neuromechanical matching stuff instead, you'd probably be like, something that's at best inferential and has been in more direct comparisons, maybe not refuted, but has not been approved, saying like doesn't seem to work, up against something like stretch under load, which is like every time it just keeps on giving. Kind of an easy trade-off there.
Yeah, and I think honestly, some of the stuff is just arguing for the sake of arguing. So for example, the bicep speculation, most of the time you're getting so much work for the short elbow flexors, so the brachialis and brachioradialis from rowing motions. You're doing, upper back type rowing motions, regular rowing motions, and so on, that even if you were to accept some of the neuromechanical matching stuff, it still suggests that the stretched position there would be the one that you would train anyways, because you're trying to get the biceps brachii and not the short elbow flexors.
The short elbow flexors get every single pulling movement. They got all the work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, some of the stuff is just, I feel like sometimes arguing for the sake of arguing. But yeah, I would definitely say that it's always going to be a spectrum in terms of how much each of those factors matter and when and how they interact with hypertrophy. If I'm going to make a bet, I'm going to bet on some of those more stretched positions more readily than I'm going to bet on some theoretical, especially when the underlying data is not something that I'm willing to just say for sure is what's going on. Yeah.
Especially in real life human beings. Although getting cadavers jacked is pretty important, I'd say. How do you want to look in the casket,
That's true.
Yeah. Daniel, you're a person who has lots of wisdom, and you're accruing tons of wisdom all the time. You'll be getting your PhD here in the next few years. I want to learn more about you. Where do I go? Other than your OnlyFans.
Yeah, so OnlyFans definitely available. And we got, my YouTube. So I have a very, very small YouTube channel. Quickly growing. We're almost at 200 subscribers. So
you must have doubled your subscribers in mere days.
Exactly. Yeah. So I post basically very, very infrequently, but basically like a course format for hypertrophy.
Oh, very cool.
So yeah, I have the YouTube and then Instagram. All of those are just Daniel Plotkin. And Twitter, I mostly lurk. I don't actually post too often. So I'd say the two best places are Instagram and YouTube.
Instagram and YouTube. Yep. Very good. Folks, Daniel is the man, super sharp. Anything that comes out of his mouth is very likely to be true. Find him where you can find him. And thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time.